Some stories refuse to stay buried. They wait in
Some
stone. They hide in
stories
water.
refuse
They coil
to
through
stay
old prayers.
buried.
They watch from ruined walls.
They
arrive
wait
before
in
the first kings.
stone.
They return
They
when the flood
return
recedes.
when the flood
They teach.
recedes.
They warn.
They
They
teach.
vanish. And
They
somehow
warn.
they keep the same
They
shape.
vanish.
Half memory.
And
half
somehow
symbol,
they keep
half
something older.
Across the ancient world, cultures separated by deserts, mountains, and entire oceans described uncanny figures that seem to echo one
another.
Not
A
with
being
perfect agreement,
tied to
not
water.
with identical names, but
A
with the
being
same
tied
unsettling
to
outline.
wisdom.
A being
A
tied
being
to water.
part
A being
human
tied to
and
wisdom.
part
A being
serpent,
part human and part
fish,
serpent,
or
fish
dragon.
or dragon.
A visitor from beneath, beyond, or before.
And once you notice that
pattern,
it becomes very hard to unsee.
unsee.
The sages from the sea. The year is long before history becomes comfortable. You are standing on a shore at the edge of Mesopotamia, where the Persian Gulf breathes mist into the morning. Out on the water, something moves that should not move the way it does. It is not a fish. It is not a man. It is both. In later Babylonian tradition, a being called Oannes rises from the sea and walks among humans by day. The old description is famous for a reason. He has the body of a fish, yet beneath that fish form is a human head, human feet, and a human mind. And he does not come ashore to conquer. He comes ashore to teach, writing, measurement, law, building agriculture, arts, and sciences. That detail matters. Ancient myths are full of monsters, but this is something stranger than a monster. This is a civilizing being, a thing from the water that carries knowledge instead of teeth. The record says Oannes instructed mankind in the skills that make cities possible. That means the creature was remembered not as a destroyer of civilization, but almost as its midwife. And then it gets stranger. Mesopotamian tradition does not stop with one aquatic teacher. It preserves the idea of apkallu, wise antediluvian sages linked to deep time, divine knowledge, and the world before the flood. In art, some appear in fish cloaks. Others hold ritual objects. Others stand like guardians, half priest and half something more ancient. If you saw one carved into stone without context, you might call it symbolic. If you saw the same kind of figure appear again and again across centuries, you might begin to wonder whether symbolism was only part of the story. Here is where it gets strange. Mesopotamia did not describe its wisdom bringers as shining angels drifting down from the clouds. It described them as beings of the water. Amphibious, hybrid, liminal. They belong to a boundary, not fully human, not fully animal, not fully divine in the simple sense either. They emerge from the place where land ends and the unknown begins. That boundary theme will follow us all the way through this list, because once the sages come from the deep, the world changes. Fields are measured. Walls are raised. Names are written. Order appears. That is a very specific memory for a myth to preserve. Not just a god made things, but a being arrived and showed us how to live. Some researchers read that as the normal language of mythic origins. Others see a deeper archetype at work, the memory of civilization itself, externalized into a teacher from beyond the village. And of course, some people make the biggest leap of all. They ask whether stories like Oannes preserve a rumor from prehistory, a rumor that humans everywhere once imagined or believed that knowledge came from non-human visitors. That theory is dramatic. It is also unproven. What is real is the text. What is real is the image. What is real is the pattern. An amphibious instructor, a fish-cloaked sage, a bringer of arts and sciences rising from the edge of the sea. And no matter how you explain it, that is not an ordinary beginning. Because the first civilization in the story did not say wisdom fell from a throne. It said wisdom walked out of the water, and if that sounds familiar already, it should. We are only at the beginning. The serpent king beneath Athens. In ancient Greece, not every founder was remembered as fully human. That alone should make you pause. Because cultures usually imagine their first rulers in flattering terms. Strong, noble, beautiful, or assuringly like us. But the old king of Athens was not remembered that way. He was remembered as Cecrops. Traditional accounts place him at the dawn of Attica, the first king of the land, a founder standing at the threshold of civilization. Yet his shape was never simple. From the waist up, he was a man. From the waist down, a serpent. Not metaphorically, not just poetically. That hybrid body is central to how he was imagined. And when a culture places a half-serpent being at the head of its own origin story, it is worth asking why. The investigation starts with his role. Cecrops is not merely a monster parked in the margins. He is tied to order, to settlement, to rulership, to the naming and structuring of the city itself. In later tradition, he becomes the kind of culture founder who helps define law, marriage, and the earliest forms of organized social life. Again, that detail matters. A hybrid being is not banished to chaos. A hybrid being presides over beginnings. The record says otherwise than we might expect. When modern people hear serpent in myth, they often think immediately of deceit or threat. But that is not the full ancient picture. In older worlds, serpents are often guardians of sacred places, keepers of earth power, watchers of thresholds, beings connected to chthonic wisdom. In other words, they belong to the deep, the underlayer, the place beneath stone and grave and root. Cecrops fits that pattern with eerie precision. He is earthborn, boundary crossing, part ruler, part underworld sign, part ancestor, part creature. And then it gets stranger. Greek myth preserves other serpent-bodied or dragon-linked founders too, which means Cecrops is not a random one-off tucked into a dusty corner. He belongs to a broader old imagination in which land, kingship, and serpentine power overlap. That overlap keeps returning in ancient cultures that had no easy way to consult one another. Why would a first king look like that? Why would a founder need scales at all? Why would wisdom, legitimacy, and the serpent body keep touching in story after story? One answer is symbolism. The serpent marks autochthony, the idea that a people sprang from their own soil. That is a serious explanation. It may even be the best one. But symbols are chosen for reasons, and when old societies reach for the language of the deepest earth to explain who first taught order, the choice is not accidental. Here is where it gets strange. Cecrops does not merely resemble a reptile in passing. He fuses human governance with non-human form. That fusion is the point. It tells listeners that the first order of the city did not feel entirely human in origin. It felt received from a being who stood between categories. You can hear the echo already. A teacher from outside ordinary humanity, a founder carrying a body that signals contact with the underlayer of the world. A civilizing presence emerging not from the crowd, but from the threshold. By itself, Greece might look unique. Placed beside Mesopotamia, it begins to look like an old rhyme. A fish sage from the sea. A serpent king from the earth. Different names, different lands, the same uneasy idea that at the beginning, something not quite human showed us how to live. And Greece was far from finished with that idea, neither was the world. Number 6. The serpent people of ancient India travel east into the oldest layers of South Asian myth, and the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. There, the beings are called nagas. They are not a single character, they are a race, semi-divine, half-human and half-cobra, sometimes wholly serpentine, sometimes wholly human. Sometimes shown with a human torso rising above a coiled body and a hooded canopy of many serpent heads. Already the image feels familiar. Hybrid form, disdom, threshold status. But that is not the strange part. The strange part is where they live and what they guard. Traditional descriptions place the nagas in an underground realm filled with splendid palaces and brilliant jewels. They are associated with rivers, lakes, wells, and seas. They guard treasure. They protect sacred power. They can be dangerous, yet they are often beneficial to humans. And that double nature shows up again and again in stories that feel older than any one religion using them. Some naga figures are protectors. Some are kings. Some shelter holy beings. Some are woven into dynastic origin stories as if human lines themselves wanted ancestry that reached down into the serpent world. That is a remarkable instinct. Not away from the serpent, toward it. Here is where it gets strange. The naga is never only an animal. It is a people, a category of intelligence. A civilization beneath civilization. That phrase sounds modern, but the old idea is not. It is built into the mythology itself. There is an underworld domain. There are rulers. There are treasures. There are encounters with the human realm. There is knowledge. And there is transformation. Shape-shifting matters here. A being that can appear as serpent, person, or both, is a being that crosses borders naturally. That is exactly what ancient cultures keep assigning to these mysterious figures. They cross water, they cross earth, they cross form, they cross the distance between gods and us. Some people read the nagas as pure religious symbolism, guardians of fertility, water, and subterranean wealth. That explanation makes sense. In agrarian societies, control over water is survival itself. Of course, powerful beings would gather there in myth. But symbols still accumulate details, and details tell us what a culture found memorable. The nagas are not just snakes in a field, they are social, intentional, hierarchical, beautiful, intelligent, sometimes moral, sometimes wrathful, always more than animal. When later art places a many-hooded serpent over a meditating holy figure like a sheltering canopy, the image is unforgettable. Protection descends from a being that belongs to the deep, not the cloud, not the mountain peak, the deep. And then it gets stranger. Indian tradition also links serpent beings to cosmic scenes. The world rests near them, the cosmic ocean turns through them, creation itself brushes against their coils. That is an astonishing elevation for a figure modern minds would rush to file under monster. Ancient minds did not rush, they lingered. They saw significance in the serpent form that later cultures often flattened into fear. So ask yourself something. If Mesopotamia remembered amphibious sages, and Greece remembered a serpent founder, and India preserved whole races of wise serpent beings beneath the world, are these simply separate inventions? Maybe. But if they are, why do they keep converging on the same details? Hybrid body, secret realm, water connection, treasure, instruction, protection, danger, danger. A power that is not comfortably human, yet remains close to human destiny. At some point, coincidence starts to feel less satisfying than patterned, and the pattern is only getting clearer. The dragon kings of ancient China. In China, the old being in the water does not slither through myth as a minor creature. It rules. The dragon, Long, is not the European nightmare of hoarded gold and fire-blackened villages. It is older and stranger than that, majestic, beneficent, linked to rain, rivers, lakes, seas, and the turning of the sky. Ancient ritual already treated the dragon as a rain power. That means communities were not simply decorating stories, they were negotiating survival. When rain decides harvest and harvest decides hunger, the being that controls water becomes terrifyingly important. The investigation gets more interesting when the categories deepen. Ancient Chinese thought described multiple dragon types, including dragons of heaven, hidden treasure, waterways, and winds. Then popular belief folds some of those powers into the dragon kings, rulers of the four oceans, bringers of rain, protectors of seafarers. Again the pattern appears. Not a beast, a Kav, a ruler, a keeper of thresholds, a power that dwells in waters yet influences the fate of those on land. And look at the body. Scaled, snake-like, horned, unmistakably, more than human. But unlike the brute monsters of later fantasy, these dragons stand inside the moral and political fabric of the world. Emperors borrowed the dragon as a sign of sacred authority. That is not what people do with a thing they consider merely chaotic. That is what they do with a form they believe mediates power itself. Here is where it gets strange. Chinese dragons do not just inhabit water. They move between water and sky. They roam the heavens and dwell in rivers. They bridge vertical worlds. When you start tracking ancient mysterious beings, that bridging function shows up constantly. They are mediators. Sea and shore, earth and heaven, living and dead, visible and hidden, human and not. The dragon kings take that old role and magnify it. Each one governs a sea. Each one can deliver rain. Each one has intention, domain, and consequence. If a storm rises, the old imagination does not hear random weather. It hears a decision made somewhere beyond human sight, and that idea too has siblings around the world, because once a serpent dragon intelligence controls the waters, ordinary geography begins to feel inhabited. 3. River mouth becomes an entrance. Every lake becomes a door. Every wave might be surface only. Some explanations remain grounded. Of course, dragon myths cluster around water in a civilization deeply shaped by flood, river management, and seasonal rain. That is persuasive, but it still leaves the shape of the myth unexplained. Why intelligence? Why rulership? Why moral relationship? Why not simply say rain falls because it falls? Why populate the waters with ancient serpentines, sky-reaching authorities? And why does that begin sounding familiar once it stands beside the naga, beside Oannes, beside Cecrops? Because the surface costumes change. Fish cloak, cobra hood, scaled dragon body. But beneath them sits the same cold silhouette, an older-than-human intelligence bound to water and order. A being feared, respected, and petitioned because human life depends on it. And then it gets stranger. In some ancient traditions, the dragon also guards hidden treasure. There it is again. The thing below the world does not simply threaten us. It keeps something. Wisdom, water, tower, jewels, the secret of continuity itself. That is not random decoration. That is a worldview. The deep holds life. The deep holds knowledge. The deep is ruled, and the ruler often looks serpentine. By now, the pattern is no longer a whisper. It is a drumbeat. But the next culture will give it color and feathers. The Rainbow Serpent of ancient Australia. Some stories are not pinned to one temple or one kingdom. They stretch across entire landscapes, across languages, across immense spans of time. The Rainbow Serpent is one of those stories. In many Aboriginal Australian traditions, this being is tied to creation, water, fertility, and the shaping of the land itself. It is not a casual legend. It is ancient presence, an ancestral force moving through the dreaming, leaving rivers, ridges, waterholes, and sacred places in its wake. What matters here is not flattening many traditions into one neat summary. Different communities tell different versions. That honesty matters. Still, a strong thread remains. A serpent power linked to life-giving water, a being that shapes the world, a force that can create, sustain, punish, or protect. And once again, we are dealing with something more intelligent than an animal, and more intimate than a distant sky god. You do not merely worship a serpent like this. You live inside its geography. That is the unnerving part. The story is not about a creature over there. The story is about the land beneath your feet already bearing its passage. A bend in the river is no longer just geology. It is memory. A deep pool is no longer just water. It is presence. Here is where it gets strange. The Rainbow Serpent belongs to the oldest continuing cultural traditions on Earth. That means the serpent as life power pattern is not limited to literate empires trading texts across the ancient Near East. It appears in a continent-spanning oral world as well. Different environment, different languages, different cosmology, and still the old outline returns: water, power, collation, a serpent being that exceeds ordinary nature. Some versions emphasize abundance, some emphasize danger, some hold both at once. That doubling should sound familiar by now. The beings on this list are rarely simple benefactors. They give life and withhold it. They reveal order and punish trespass. They dwell at thresholds and make those thresholds sacred. And that makes the serpent form feel less like decoration and more like a coded language humans kept reaching for. Why that language? Because serpents move close to the ground and disappear into it. Because they emerge from hidden places. Because they shed skin and seem to renew themselves. Because watercourses also appear, vanish, flood, and return. Those are strong, symbolic reasons. Maybe strong enough, but here is the uneasy question. If those reasons are sufficient, why do so many cultures still push beyond symbolism into personality, memory, and encounter? Why are these beings not only signs but presences? Why do they feel remembered? And then it gets stranger. The Rainbow Serpent does not fit comfortably into modern categories at all. It is not just creator, not just animal, not just ancestor, not just force. It moves among those categories the way a real serpent moves through grass, leaving no corner fully settled. That category blurring is one of the oldest signals on this list. The mysterious being is always more than one thing. That is what makes it powerful. That is what makes it hard to dismiss. And that is what makes it feel so strangely close to the half-fish sage, the serpent king, the naga, and the dragon ruler. By this point, you may be hearing the same rhythm I am, not one global myth, but one recurring intuition, that beneath the oldest human memories, there are beings of water and coil and hidden intelligence, and our ancestors kept giving them names. Which of these would you dare to open? Tell me below, but the strangest ones are still ahead. the feathered serpent of the Maya. At Chichen Itza, stone itself seems to perform memory. On the Great Pyramid, light and shadow can create the illusion of a serpent descending the staircase. Even before you know the name, the image gets under your skin, a serpent coming down from above. Sky meeting stone, motion carved into architecture. Among the Maya, the being we often call Kukulkan is the plumed or feathered serpent. That combination is immediately strange, a creature of the ground wearing the sign of the sky. Scale and feather, earth and air, crawl and flight. Once again, a threshold being, not trapped in one realm, crossing between them. That may be the single most important recurring trait in this entire countdown. These beings do not stay where nature tells them to stay. They cross. The investigation becomes even stranger when you consider what a feathered serpent means in symbolic terms. Not merely a snake, not merely a bird, but a union of opposites, a visible way of imagining a power that links heavens, earth, weather, kingship, and sacred knowledge. Cultures across Mesoamerica preserve versions of this figure, which suggests the form carried unusual staying power. Forms do not travel that far for no reason. They endure because they mean something deep. In Maya context, the feathered serpent is tied to divinity, rulership, and cosmic order. It becomes part of how sacred authority is seen, not abstractly, visually, architecturally, publicly, stone after stone, temple after temple. Here is where it gets strange. A feathered serpent should not exist. That obvious fact is the key. Hybrid sacred beings are not errors in old storytelling. They are solutions. Ancient people wanted a shape that could hold more than one domain at once, so they fused bodies, and when they fused bodies, they repeatedly chose the serpent. Why not the feathered jaguar? Why not the winged deer? Why not a dozen other combinations? Why does the serpent keep winning that role? One answer is that snakes already carried deep sacred charge. They moved between surface and hidden places. They struck fast. They shed skin. They felt ancient. Then feathers lifted that ancient thing into the realm of the sky. What you get is not a monster, you get a bridge. And bridges matter in mystery. Because every being on this list is a bridge of some kind. Oannes bridges sea and city. Cecrops bridges earth and kingship. Nagas bridge underworld and humanity. Dragon kings bridge water and heaven. The Rainbow Serpent bridges land and creation. Kukulkan bridges earth and sky and a body you can draw with one line. And then it gets stranger. A stare-shadow serpent descending a temple is more than art. It is choreography between cosmos and stone. It tells viewers that the world above can touch the world below on schedule. The old being can arrive again, not in flesh perhaps, but in pattern, in ritual light, in the exact return of a shape. That does something powerful to the human mind. It makes myth feel observable. The serpent is no longer only remembered, it appears. For people standing there, that must have felt less like metaphor than visitation. And once a culture has built an entire sacred landscape around a descending serpent, the idea is no longer small, it is civilizational, which means by now we have reached a point where these beings are not occasional mythic ornaments. They are central. They help hold whole worlds together. But the next version of the serpent gets even closer to a culture hero, and once that happens, the pattern becomes almost impossible to ignore. The feathered serpent of central Mexico. If the Maya gave the serpent feathers, central Mexico gave that figure a biography large enough to haunt centuries. The name most people know is Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, one of the major deities of ancient Mexico. But a title that important almost never stays simple. Quetzalcoatl is linked to wind, to Venus, to priesthood, to books, to the calendar, to craftsmen, and to the uneasy border between death and rebirth. He is not one thing. He is a cluster of powers orbiting the same strange body, and that body is still the same impossible union, bird and snake, sky and earth. As if the old imagination of the threshold had found its most refined form, the record says this figure was no minor local curiosity. Representations of the feathered serpent reach back deep into Mesoamerican history. Later traditions remember Quetzalcoatl not only as a deity, but also in forms that blur toward culture hero and priest king. There is the learned patron, the inventor, the civilizing force, the one connected to order, ritual, and knowledge. Again, the same old drumbeat. The mysterious being is not merely worshipped. It teaches, it organizes, it defines how humans live. Here is where it gets strange. In some traditions, Quetzalcoatl descends into the underworld to gather ancient bones, then gives them life so the present human world can exist. That is a profound, mythic role, not a storm beast, not a trick snake, a mediator of creation through the dead. Once more, the serpent being stands between realms and carries something across. That crossing theme never leaves, even stories of departure keep it. One famous version sends Quetzalcoatl eastward, toward the divine waters, beyond the horizon. In another account, he leaves on a raft of snakes. Pause there. A raft of snakes. You can almost see the ancient storyteller smiling at the image. Even exile must happen through serpent form. Some later legends tangled that eastern departure with expectations of return. Those stories became historically dangerous in the age of conquest when myth and catastrophe collided. But long before that collision, the outline was already old. A being of knowledge, a being of motion between worlds, a being linked to sacred order and the horizon beyond sight. And then it gets stranger. Quetzalcoatl could also appear in human guise. There it is again, the fluid boundary, human, another form and transformation. He is serpent but not confined to serpent, wind god but not confined to wind, teacher but not reduced to simple instruction. The old mysterious beings refuse fixed categories as if fixed categories belong only to us. That refusal is one of the most haunting consistencies on this list. Modern skepticism often asks, did ancient people really believe in such beings? That may be the wrong question. A better one might be, what did these beings allow ancient people to think? They allowed the world to be connected. They allowed knowledge to arrive from elsewhere. They allowed the boundary between visible and invisible to remain porous, and perhaps most of all, they allowed civilizations to imagine that the principles holding life together were not invented by ordinary humans alone. That is why Quetzalcoatl matters here, not because he proves anything sensational, but because he pushes the pattern to its sharpest point. A feathered serpent associated with books, calendars, priesthood, craftsmanship, death, rebirth, and the far horizon. If that does not feel like the memory of a being larger than any one function, nothing will. And still, somehow, there is one final figure whose entrance makes the whole list feel less like coincidence and more like a recurring ancient intuition. The wanderer from the waters of the Andes. Picture the high, cold light around Lake Titicaca. Not the heat of jungle stone, not the marshes of river deltas. A different world entirely. Thin air, hard blue sky, water bright as metal. And from that region, in Andean tradition, comes one of the most unsettling culture heroes of them all. Viracocha, creator deity Dewandera, teacher, a being remembered as moving through the world after creation, instructing people in the arts of civilization. That last part should stop you cold, because by now you know exactly what we are hearing, not just a maker.a teacher again. Viracocha forms the world, orders it, and then travels through it teaching. That is the old pattern, stripped to its bones, a being from beyond ordinary humanity who arrives after chaos and shows humans how to live. Some traditions place his origins in or near sacred waters, including the region of Lake Titicaca. Then he moves outward, through settlements, through memory, through the long imagination of the Andes. He is sometimes depicted as a creator, sometimes a culture hero, sometimes both at once. That blending matters. The most ancient mysterious beings often refuse our neat divisions between maker, king, priest, traveler, and teacher. Viracocha does too. Here is where it gets strange. This is now the third major civilizational tradition on our list, preserving the image of knowledge arriving through a larger-than-human being tied to water, journey, and order. Mesopotamia had Oannes coming from the sea. Mesoamerica had Quetzalcoatl moving toward or from the divine waters beyond the horizon. The Andes remember Viracocha associated with sacred waters and wandering instruction, different continents, different languages, the same narrative skeleton. Some scholars interpret this simply as the widespread mythic need for culture heroes. That explanation is strong, Every civilization wants to know who taught the first people to build, weave, measure, govern, and remember. But even if that is true, the repeated costume is still eerie. Why so often a figure tied to water? Why so often a figure with ambiguous form or liminal nature? Why so often a traveler from the edge, not a teacher born quietly inside the village? And then it gets stranger. Viracocha is not only associated with origins, he is associated with movement. He goes among people, he teaches them, then he departs. That departure motif closes around the list like a ring. Oannes returns to the sea. Quetzalcoatl moves toward the horizon. Many serpent and dragon beings remain beneath or beyond ordinary sight. The teacher comes, the teacher gives, the teacher goes. What remains is civilization and a story that sounds almost like witness testimony, worn smooth by centuries. That does not make it literal history. It does make it haunting, because the oldest memories of ordered life from more than one part of the world keep placing a stranger at the beginning. Not always human, often aquatic, often serpentine, often radiant with authority, often impossible to classify. This is why Viracocha belongs at number 1. Not because the mystery is solved there, because the mystery becomes impossible to ignore there. The highest mountains preserve an echo of the same being that walked out of Mesopotamian water and coiled through temples half a world away. Different names, different masks, one old feeling that our ancestors looked backward and saw, standing at the edge of the first cities, someone already waiting. So what have we actually found in this countdown? Not proof of one literal species roaming the ancient world, not a secret file hidden under a government seal, not a tidy answer that makes every culture collapse into one story. What we found is more interesting than that. We found a recurring human memory pattern so persistent that it crossed continents. Mesopotamia remembered Oannes, the amphibious instructor from the sea. Greece remembered Cecrops, the serpent-bodied founder tied to the earliest order of Athens. India preserved the nagas, wise and dangerous serpent beings of the hidden depths and waters. China revered dragons and dragon kings that ruled seas, delivered rain, and held sacred authority over life. Aboriginal Australian traditions carried the Rainbow Serpent, a water-linked ancestral power shaping land, life, and law. The Maya raised the feathered serpent into architecture, making earth and sky meet in one descending sacred form. Central Mexico remembered Quetzalcoatl, a feathered serpent bound to books, ritual, craftsmanship, death, and return. And the Andes told of Viracocha, the wanderer teacher who moved through the world after creation and taught civilization. Look at those figures side by side, and the similarities start to feel deliberate, even if they were never meant that way. Water, thresholds, hybrid bodies, underworlds, skies' treasure instruction, departure. A strange closeness to the founding of culture itself. Maybe those are the natural symbols of human survival. Maybe water always invites the imagination, serpents always feel ancient, and civilization always needs a teacher larger than life. Maybe that is enough, or maybe our ancestors were circling a mystery they could feel but never fully name, a presence beneath the world, a wisdom beyond the village, a category of being that was never just God, never just animal, never just memory, something in between, something crossing, something old. That may be why these stories remain so hard to shake. They do not behave like closed myths. They behave like fragments of a conversation happening in many places at once. A conversation about where knowledge comes from, about why water feels inhabited, about why the serpent body keeps carrying meanings that human language alone cannot hold. And maybe that is the deepest mystery of all. Not whether these were the exact same beings in a literal sense, but why so many ancient cultures, separated by impossible distances, kept reaching for nearly the same shape when they spoke about beginnings. If they were only inventing, they invented along eerily parallel lines. If they were preserving something older, that older thing was powerful enough to survive in myth. Either way, the pattern remains. The deep teaches, the coil remembers, the founder is not entirely human, and our oldest stories still glance nervously toward the water. Maybe because that is where life began. Maybe because that is where memory hides. Or maybe because somewhere in the oldest imagination of our species, the first teacher was already standing there, waiting for us to notice. There is one more detail worth carrying with you after a list like this. Almost every being we met tonight lives near an entrance, a shoreline, a river, a lake, a spring, a cave, a temple stair, a buried realm, a horizon line. Ancient people did not place their mysteries in the middle of empty fields. They placed them at openings, places where one world appears to touch another. That may be psychology. It may also be memory. Water especially seems to trigger the old imagination in a way stone alone rarely does. Water hides depth. Water reflects the sky. Water preserves life and takes it away without warning. Staying beside deep water at night, and even a modern mind begins to populate it. Now imagine doing that in a world where every harvest, every migration, and every flood depended on forces you could not predict. Of course, the deep would seem inhabited. Of course, knowledge might be imagined as coming from there, and yet symbolism does not fully drain the unease from these stories, because symbols usually simplify. These beings complicate. They wear crowns. They teach laws. They carry books, calendars, crafts, treasure, dynasties, and cosmic roles. They enter history at exactly the point where scattered people become ordered societies. That is an oddly specific place for fantasy to gather. You can feel why ancient listeners kept returning to it. Civilization itself is mysterious when you stand close enough to its beginning. Someone first measured the field. Someone first named the stars for planting. Someone first decided where walls should rise and where graves should rest. For people looking backward due centuries, those first acts may have felt too large for ordinary ancestors alone. So the teacher became amplified, part ruler, part serpent, part wanderer, part divine emissary, part memory of a lost age. That does not make the myths false. It makes them honest in a different way. Honest about the scale of the human mystery. Honest about how strange it feels that our species crossed from shelter to city, from gesture to writing, from fear to ritual order. Sometimes myth is what history sounds like after the names have worn away. Sometimes myth is the costume memory puts on when details are gone, but the feeling remains. That is why these old beings linger. They may be legends, but they guard real questions. Where did order come from? Why does wisdom feel received as often as invented? Why do beginnings so often look less like progress and more like contact? And why, when ancient cultures tried to picture that contact, did so many of them choose scales, coils, feathers, water, and eyes from the dark? Perhaps because serpents are nature's own threshold creatures. They vanish underground and return. They slip through cracks where bodies should not fit. They renew by shedding skin. They move without limbs as if ordinary rules hardly apply to them. They are close to the earth yet strangely beyond it. A perfect body for mystery. Add water and you have an even older equation. Depth plus transformation. Hiddenness plus life. Danger plus nourishment. A door that feeds you and can swallow you. That combination may be one of the oldest sacred formulas on earth, so maybe the exact same beings were never the point. Maybe what cultures shared was a recognition that when humans try to speak about the first arrival of knowledge, the language becomes hybrid. We stop describing ordinary teachers. We start describing threshold beings. And once that happens, myth across the world begins to rhyme. Not word for word, image for image. That kind of rhyme can survive thousands of years. It can survive conquests, translation, lost temples, broken tablets, burned libraries, and entire vanished cities. It can survive because it speaks to something that still feels true even now. We are a species that learn by receiving, from parents, from strangers, from nature, from disaster, from the dead, from stories. Maybe our ancestors took that feeling of reception and gave it a face, a serpent face, a fish face, a vishjershase, a dragon face, a face just human enough to approach us and just inhuman enough to overwhelm us. If that is what happened, then these myths are not primitive mistakes. They are elegant containers for one of the oldest human intuitions. That wisdom arrives from beyond the self, from the deep, from the edge, from somewhere we do not fully control, and maybe that is why the stories still work. Not because they ask us to believe every detail literally, because they remind us that history is never only dates and ruins. It is also atmosphere. It is what people feared at night, what they thanked at dawn, what they sensed moving just beneath the surface when the world was still new. If you want more ancient mysteries told in the dark spaces between fact, legend, and the things history still cannot explain, stay with Ozzy. Subscribe, and I will meet you in the next one. Until then, if you ever find yourself at the edge of an old ruin, a silent river, or a lake that feels deeper than it should, listen carefully. Some stories do not end, they surface.